Willie Francis. Mid-20th century Louisiana, where racial tensions simmered beneath the surface of everyday life and the justice system often reflected the deep-seated prejudices of the Jim Crow South, provided the backdrop for one of the most harrowing tales of survival in American legal history. Born on January 12, 1929, in St. Martinville, Louisiana, a black teenager from a modest background would become the first known person in the United States to survive a botched execution by electrocution. The saga began with the murder of Andrew Thomas, a well-respected 53-year-old white pharmacist, found dead outside his home on November 27, 1944, with 5 bullet wounds from a .38 caliber pistol. For 9 months, the case remained unsolved until Willie's arrest in Port Arthur, Texas, in August 1945. Police detained the 16-year-old after discovering him with what they claimed was Thomas's wallet, though no such wallet was ever produced as evidence in court. Interrogated without a lawyer or family present, Willie initially pointed fingers at others before confessing in writing with the cryptic words, "It was a secret about me and him." The trial that followed was emblematic of racial disparities in the Southern legal system, lasting only 2 days with court-appointed attorneys who mounted no real defense. The all-white jury deliberated for less than an hour before convicting him of first-degree murder. On May 3, 1946, 17-year-old Willie was strapped into Louisiana's portable electric chair nicknamed Gruesome Gertie at the St. Martinville Parish Jail. At 12:08 p.m., the switch was thrown, causing his body to convulse violently and the chair to jump off the floor. Willie screamed in agony, "Take it off! Take it off! Let me breathe!" But the current was insufficient to kill him due to a botched setup by an intoxicated prison guard and inmate who had improperly wired the device. The case reached the U.S. Supreme Court, which, in a narrow 5-4 ruling, sided against Willie. On May 9, 1947, Willie was led back to Gruesome Gertie and executed successfully at age 18. Rommel Broom. A chilling chapter in the modern history of capital punishment unfolded in Ohio through the case of a man whose survival of a botched, lethal injection attempt would push the boundaries of what constitutes cruel and unusual punishment. Born in 1956 in Ohio, Broom was convicted in 1985 of the kidnapping, rape, and murder of 14-year-old Trina Middleton, a black teenager from Cleveland who was abducted while walking home from a high school football game on September 21, 1984. The crime that sealed Broom's fate was brutal in its execution. He lured Trina into his car, sexually assaulted her, and stabbed her 7 times, leaving her body in an abandoned lot. The investigation was swift, aided by witness testimonies and physical evidence, leading to Broom's arrest and subsequent conviction by an all-white jury in 1985 on charges of aggravated murder, kidnapping, rape, and robbery. After spending over 2 decades on death row navigating appeals that challenged his conviction on grounds of ineffective counsel and racial bias, Broom's execution was scheduled for September 15, 2009, at the Southern Ohio Correctional Facility. What followed became one of the most infamous botched executions in U.S. history, as the execution team attempted to insert IV lines for over 2 hours, jabbing Broom's arms, legs, and ankles with needles at least 18 times. Witnesses reported that Broom was in visible pain, wincing and grimacing with each failed attempt, even trying to assist by pointing out potential veins and rubbing his arms to improve blood flow. After more than 2 hours with no successful IV line established, Governor Ted Strickland ordered the execution halted. The Ohio Supreme Court ruled 4-3 in State v. Broom, 2016, that because no lethal drugs were administered, a second attempt would not violate constitutional protections. However, Broom contracted COVID-19 and died on December 28, 2020, at age 64, before a second execution attempt scheduled for 2022 could take place. Alva Campbell. Among the most complex intersections of criminal justice, health complications, and the death penalty system stands the case of a man whose troubled upbringing and repeat offending culminated in a botched execution attempt that highlighted the practical and ethical dilemmas of executing aging, infirm inmates. Born on April 30, 1948, into a deeply dysfunctional family environment in Ohio, Campbell endured severe physical and emotional abuse from his parents, with his father institutionalized for rape and his mother allegedly prostituting her daughters. Campbell's criminal trajectory began early, leading to his conviction of first-degree murder in 1972 for killing an adult male during a robbery in Cleveland. After serving 20 years, he was paroled in 1992, but his freedom proved short-lived. On April 2, 1997, while facing aggravated robbery charges, Campbell orchestrated a violent escape, overpowering Deputy Sheriff Teresa Harrison and carjacking 18-year-old Charles Diles. The subsequent crime that would define Campbell's legacy was calculated and cold-blooded. After forcing Diles to drive around Columbus for approximately 3 hours at gunpoint, Campbell shot the young man twice in the head at close range to eliminate him as a witness. Diles was an innocent bystander, a recent high school graduate with no connection to Campbell, making the murder particularly shocking to the Columbus community. By 2017, Campbell's health had deteriorated dramatically due to chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, asthma, prostate cancer, and heart problems, requiring a colostomy bag and oxygen support. On November 15, 2017, at the Southern Ohio Correctional Facility, 69-year-old Campbell was prepared for execution by lethal injection. The execution team spent approximately 80 minutes attempting to insert IV lines, probing his arms, right shin, and other areas with a UV light to locate veins, but his compromised vascular system proved impenetrable. After multiple failed attempts causing visible bruising and pain, the execution was halted around 10:30 a.m. Campbell died of natural causes on March 3, 2018, at age 69 from terminal cancer and respiratory failure. Doyle Lee Hamm. A grim tapestry woven from childhood poverty, crime, and the barbaric realities of America's death penalty system emerged through the case of a man whose botched execution attempt exposed fundamental flaws in capital punishment practices. Born on February 14, 1957 in Alabama, Doyle Lee Hamm was the 10th of 12 children in a family plagued by dysfunction and criminality, where his father encouraged theft among his children, and 6 of Hamm's older brothers had served time in jail. Growing up in a rural, impoverished environment, Hamm endured what his sister later described as constant hell all the time. His father's toxic influence fostered a cycle of lawlessness, telling his children, "If you don't go out and steal, then you're not a Hamm." Academic struggles compounded his troubles. By 5th grade, he read at a first-grade level, eventually dropping out in 9th grade while beginning substance abuse as a teenager. Hamm's descent culminated in a fatal robbery on January 24, 1987, when he robbed the Anderson Motel in Cullman, Alabama, shooting and killing nighttime clerk Patrick Cunningham with a .38 caliber pistol. Using a gun stolen earlier that day in Mississippi, Hamm fired a single shot to Cunningham's head during the heist, fleeing with $350 from the register and $60 from the victim's wallet. Arrested the next day, he was tried and convicted of capital murder in 1987. By the 2010s, Hamm's health deteriorated dramatically after being diagnosed with B-cell lymphoma and cranial cancer in February 2014. The disease manifested in a large malignant tumor behind his left eye and abnormal lymph nodes throughout his body, while hepatitis C and long-term effects of intravenous drug use scarred his veins. On February 22, 2018, Alabama subjected 61-year-old Hamm to what his lawyer called torture during a nearly 3-hour ordeal, with execution team members making at least 11 punctures causing profuse bleeding and severe pain. In a confidential settlement, the state agreed not to seek another execution date. Hamm died on November 28, 2021, at age 64, from complications of the very illnesses that had made his execution unfeasible. Kenneth Eugene Smith. A pivotal and controversial chapter in the evolution of capital punishment unfolded through the case of a man whose survival of a botched lethal injection led to his becoming the first person in the world executed by nitrogen hypoxia. Born on July 4, 1965 in Alabama, Smith became entangled in a murder-for-hire plot in 1988 when Charles Sennett Sr., a minister deeply in debt, hired Smith and accomplice John Forrest Parker to kill his wife for $1,000 each. The crime that would define Smith's legacy occurred during the height of his involvement in petty criminal activities. On March 18, 1988, Smith and Parker broke into the Sennett's home in Colbert County, staging a burglary scene while bludgeoning and stabbing 45-year-old Elizabeth Sennett with a fireplace poker. She suffered over a dozen wounds, dying from blunt force trauma and blood loss, while Charles Sennett committed suicide a week later when suspicions turned toward him. Smith's trial in 1989 resulted in conviction, but remarkably, a jury recommended life without parole by an 11-1 vote. However, Judge N. Pride Tompkins overrode the jury's recommendation, sentencing Smith to death under Alabama's controversial judicial override practice. In a 1996 retrial after his conviction was overturned due to prosecutorial misconduct, another jury again voted 11-1 for life, but the judge imposed death. On November 17, 2022, at Holman Correctional Facility, 57-year-old Smith endured over 4 hours of agony as the execution team repeatedly failed to insert IV lines assassins. They jabbed his arms, hands, neck, and feet up to a dozen times, with Smith describing feeling a needle puncture his neck muscle like being stabbed. The attempt was halted just before midnight when the death warrant expired, marking Alabama's third botched injection in 2022. Following the failed attempt, Alabama switched to nitrogen hypoxia for Smith's rescheduled execution. On January 25, 2024, Smith became the first person executed by nitrogen gas, writhing and shaking violently for several minutes before being pronounced dead. Alan Eugene Miller. The evolving challenges of America's death penalty system found stark illustration through a case marked by a botched, lethal injection attempt, followed by execution using a controversial new method. Born on January 8, 1965, in Alabama, Miller worked as a delivery truck driver who harbored growing paranoia and resentment toward coworkers, believing they were spreading rumors about his personal life in what would escalate into a deadly workplace rampage. The crimes that sealed Miller's fate occurred on August 5, 1999, when the 34-year-old unleashed violence at two workplaces in Pelham, Alabama. Armed with a Glock 9mm pistol, he first entered Ferguson Enterprises, shooting supervisor Lee Michael Holdbrooks 5 times and co-worker Christopher Scott Yancey 6 times. Miller then drove to Post Air Gas, where he shot co-worker Terry Lee Jarvis 8 times, targeting victims' chests and faces in what prosecutors described as methodical and premeditated attacks. All 3 victims died at the scenes, leaving behind devastated families and shocking the Birmingham suburbs with the brutality of 17 bullets fired across 3 victims. Miller was arrested hours later and confessed to police, though he maintained he had snapped under pressure from workplace harassment. His trial in 2000 was swift, with prosecutors presenting overwhelming evidence while the defense argued diminished mental capacity without expert testimony to substantiate claims of depression and delusional disorder. Over 2 decades later, Miller's case gained attention when he requested execution by nitrogen hypoxia in 2018 due to concerns about his size complicating IV access. However, on September 22, 2022, Alabama attempted lethal injection, with executioners jabbing Miller approximately 18 times over 90 minutes. Miller described feeling like a pincushion as needles penetrated muscle, causing him to shake uncontrollably. The attempt was halted just before the death warrant expired. Alabama agreed not to attempt lethal injection again, honoring Miller's nitrogen hypoxia election. On September 26, 2024, Miller became the second person executed by nitrogen hypoxia, shaking and gasping for roughly 2 minutes before being pronounced dead. Thomas Eugene Creech. Idaho's longest-serving death row inmate, represents one of America's most notorious serial killers, whose survival of a botched execution attempt thrust him into national debates over capital punishment's efficacy and ethics. Born on September 9, 1950 in Ohio, Creech grew up in a troubled household where his parents divorced when he was young, and his mother remarried a man Creech later described as abusive. After dropping out of high school and a brief Navy stint, he began a nomadic life that escalated into violence in the 1970s. Creech's first known murder occurred in 1974 in California, where he killed 70-year-old Paul Schrader during a robbery. That same year, he murdered multiple victims across Oregon and California, establishing a pattern of impulsive killings often tied to robberies or disputes. His confessions numbered up to 42 murders by some accounts, though only a fraction were verified, spanning multiple states and making tracking difficult due to his nomadic lifestyle. Creech's capital conviction stemmed from a 1981 prison killing at the Idaho State Correctional Institution, where he attacked fellow inmate David Dale Jensen with a sock filled with batteries. Jensen, a 23-year-old developmentally disabled man imprisoned for car theft, died from fatal brain injuries after Creech beat him severely, fracturing his skull. Despite Creech's claims of self-defense, evidence suggested premeditation. After exhausting appeals by the 2020s, Idaho scheduled Creech's execution for February 28, 2024, the state's first in over a decade. At the Idaho Maximum Security Institution, 73-year-old Creech endured 58 minutes of failed IV insertion attempts as the medical team made 8 unsuccessful tries, probing his arms, hands, legs, and feet. Unable to establish a viable vein, possibly due to Creech's age, dehydration, or scarring from past drug use, officials halted the procedure. As of August 2025, Creech remains on death row with no rescheduled execution amid ongoing legal challenges. John Babacombe Lee. The foggy coastal hamlet of Babbacombe Bay near Torquay, Devon, England, during the late Victorian era, became the setting for one of history's most sensational failed executions, creating a legend that captivated the nation. Born on August 1864 in Abbotskerswell, Devon, to impoverished parents, young John grew up in modest circumstances, where formal education was a luxury his family could not afford. After a brief naval career ended due to a leg injury, he worked as a footman but was convicted of stealing 20 pounds worth of silverware in 1883, serving 6 months of hard labor. Upon release in early 1884, Lee found redemption through family ties when his half-sister Elizabeth Harris, who worked as a cook for elderly spinster Emma Ann Whitehead Keyes, helped him secure employment. Keyes, a former lady-in-waiting to Queen Victoria, charitably rehired Lee despite his criminal record, setting the stage for the tragedy that would define his legacy. The tranquility of the Glen shattered on November 15, 1884, when Emma Keyes was brutally murdered in her bedroom, her throat slashed and skull fractured by 3 lacerating blows. Her body was doused in paraffin oil and set ablaze in an apparent attempt to destroy evidence. Lee, the only male resident, claimed he awoke to smoke and helped extinguish the flames, but suspicions fell on him due to bloodstains on his clothing and a blood-soaked knife found in his bedside drawer. Lee's trial at Exeter Guildhall was perfunctory, with the prosecution hammering his criminal past while the defense called no witnesses. After 3 days, the jury convicted him of willful murder, and he was sentenced to hang on February 23, 1885, at Exeter Prison. On that cold Monday morning, 20-year-old Lee experienced 3 failed hanging attempts as the trapdoor repeatedly jammed, despite successful tests without him. Home Secretary Sir William Harcourt commuted his sentence to life imprisonment that same day. Lee was freed on December 18, 1907, after serving 22 years, becoming a celebrity who lectured on his ordeal and starred in a silent film. Wenceslao Mogel. The turbulent era of the Mexican Revolution provided the backdrop for one of history's most astonishing survival stories, involving a man who defied death by firing squad and lived to become an international sensation. Born around 1890 in the Yucatan region of Mexico, Moguel grew up in a rural, impoverished environment amid growing unrest against dictator Porfirio Diaz. Like many young men of his time, he joined revolutionary forces seeking land reform and democratic change during the chaotic conflict that claimed over 1 million lives. Fighting in Yucatan during the revolution's bloodiest phase in 1915, Moguel was captured by opposing forces and branded a traitor without trial, a common practice in the lawless conflict. Sentenced to death by firing squad on March 18, 1915 in the town of Halacho, Moguel faced 8 or 9 soldiers who fired rifles at close range. The commander then delivered the coup de grace directly to his jaw, shattering his face but miraculously missing vital brain areas. Moguel collapsed among the bodies of his executed comrades, presumed dead, but regained consciousness and crawled away under cover of night. Despite severe blood loss and infection risks, he survived with a prominent hole in his cheek where the coup de grace exited, earning the moniker El Fusilado, the executed one. The bullets had missed his heart and major arteries by sheer chance, allowing him to endure excruciating pain and disfigurement. By the 1930s, Moguel's tale caught international attention when he appeared on the American radio show Ripley's Believe It or Not in 1937, hosted by Robert Ripley, who dubbed him the world's greatest survivor. Moguel toured with Ripley's Auditorium, a traveling sideshow, displaying his scars to amazed audiences across the US and beyond. Photographs from this era show a man with grotesque facial deformity yet alive and resilient, posing with Ripley himself. Moguel died on July 29, 1975, in Merida, Yucatan at age 85, having survived 60 years after the execution attempt. Joseph Samuel. Early colonial Australia's harsh penal system and rudimentary justice practices created the setting for an extraordinary survival story that captivated the public and sparked debates about divine intervention versus human error. Born in 1780 in England, Joseph Samuel was convicted of theft in 1801 and sentenced to 7 years transportation to the penal colony of New South Wales. He arrived in Sydney Cove in 1801 aboard a convict ship, entering a brutal colonial environment of about 5,000 people under Governor Philip Gidley King. Samuel's fate was sealed in August 1803 when he and accomplice James Hardwick broke into the home of wealthy settler Benjamin Ratty in Sydney's Concord area. During the burglary, a scuffle with household servant Mary Breeze resulted in her being bludgeoned to death, though accounts differ on whether Samuel or Hardwick struck the fatal blow. Samuel was arrested the same day, found with stolen goods, while Hardwick turned informant against him. The trial in September 1803 before a colonial court was swift and unforgiving, with Samuel convicted of murder based on circumstantial evidence and Hardwick's testimony. Governor King sentenced him to death, by hanging, scheduling the execution for September 26, 1803, at Parramatta, where a crowd gathered at the rudimentary wooden gallows. What followed was a sequence of inexplicable failures that stunned onlookers. The rope snapped during the first attempt, broke again during the second try, and either slipped off or stretched during the third attempt. After 3 failures, the crowd erupted, calling it divine intervention, and the provost marshal halted the execution. Governor King reviewed the events and commuted Samuel's sentence to life imprisonment, citing divine providence and public sentiment. Details of Samuel's later years are murky, with some accounts suggesting he died in custody within a few years, possibly by 1806. Anne Green. The rigid puritanical society of 17th century England, where unwed motherhood was a grave sin and justice was swift and merciless, provided the backdrop for a remarkable tale of survival that challenged both law and science. Born around 1628 in Steeple Barton, Oxfordshire, Anne grew up in a modest family during the tumultuous English Civil War era. With limited opportunities for women of her class, she entered domestic service, working as a scullery maid at the grand household of Sir Thomas Red by 1650. Anne's ordeal began with a forbidden liaison when she was seduced by Reed's teenage grandson, who promised marriage but abandoned her when she became pregnant. In late summer 1650, while working in a secluded area of the house, Anne went into premature labor after about 17 weeks of gestation, giving birth to a tiny, stillborn boy described as underdeveloped and non-viable. Terrified of discovery and stigma, she concealed the body, but it was soon found by other servants. Under England's 1624 Act to prevent the destroying and murdering of bastard children, any unmarried woman who concealed the death of her child was presumed guilty of murder. Anne's trial at the Oxford Assizes in December 1650 painted her as an immoral servant, and despite her insistence that the baby was stillborn, the all-male jury convicted her of murder without medical examination confirming the infant's viability. On December 14, 1650, Anne was led to the public gallows at Cattle Pens in Oxford, where she dangled for over half an hour after being dropped. Friends and the executioner pulled on her legs and stomped on her chest to hasten death, and after 40 minutes, she was pronounced dead and delivered to physicians for dissection. Upon opening the coffin, Dr. William Petty and Dr. Thomas Willis heard a faint rattle and detected a weak pulse, abandoning the autopsy to begin revival efforts. Anne recovered within 2 weeks, and Parliament granted her a pardon in early 1651, citing the wonderful hand of Almighty God. She returned to Steeple Barton, married, bore 3 children, but died in 1659 at age 31 during childbirth with her 4th child. Margaret Dixon. The bustling yet unforgiving streets of 18th century Edinburgh, Scotland, where Enlightenment intellectuals coexisted with harsh realities of poverty and rigid Presbyterian morality, became the stage for a survival story that earned its protagonist legendary status. Born around 1701 in Musselburgh, Margaret married young to fisherman William Bell around 1721, but his disappearance at sea left her a destitute widow in her early 20s. Struggling as a domestic servant or fishhawker, she began an affair in 1723 that led to an unplanned pregnancy. Fearing scandal and loss of employment in a society that stigmatized unwed motherhood, Margaret concealed her condition and gave birth prematurely in early 1724 to a child who died shortly after. Panicked, she hid the body near the River Tweed, but the infant's corpse was discovered by locals, sparking an investigation that would seal her fate. Under Scotland's 1690 Act anent murthering of children, any woman who concealed her pregnancy and the subsequent death of her child was presumed guilty of infanticide. Margaret was arrested in April 1724 and charged with child murder, despite no evidence of violence or proof the infant lived beyond birth. Her trial at the High Court of Justiciary was perfunctory, with witnesses testifying to her secrecy while her lover denied involvement. On September 2, 1724, 23-year-old Margaret was carted from the toll booth to Grassmarket, where she mounted the gallows ladder and was hanged using the short drop method. After dangling for 30 minutes with relatives pulling her legs to hasten death, she was pronounced dead, placed in a coffin, and loaded onto a cart for burial in Musselburgh, 8 miles away. En route near Peffer Mill, the cart halted at an inn for refreshments when suddenly the coffin lid rattled. Margaret groaned and sat up, alive but disoriented. The driver fled, thinking her a ghost, while onlookers screamed, but she had revived, likely due to cold air and the cart's jolts, stimulating circulation. Under Scottish law, a failed execution fulfilled the sentence, and the Court of Justiciary ruled in November 1724 that Margaret had suffered the doom pronounced against her. Public fascination exploded as broadsheets dubbed her Half-Hang It Maggie, and she became a celebrity, remarrying and working as a fishwife in Edinburgh's markets for another 40 years, until dying around 1760 1965 at age 64. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed watching this video, click on one of the boxes playing on your screen to watch more similar content.